Right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Richard Schott, Senior Product Manager focused on integration services for PureCloud. And today we are going to talk about the anatomy of a data action. So we're going to cover what a data action is, why they're awesome, how you're going to be able to use them in your contact center, and really kind of dive deep into what makes up a data action and why it's a interesting and unique approach to interfacing with other systems. So before we get started, I want to tell a tale of two different contact centers. So the first contact center has just a very basic IVR. You call in, you press 1 to reach QA, you press 2 to reach QB, you press 3 to reach QC. Everything gets dumped directly into the queue. There's no prioritization. It just goes kind of round robin through to each of the agents. They're somewhat surprised because they don't have any contextual data that shows up when the call comes in. So that's contact center number 1. Contact center number 2 has implemented data actions in their call flows. Their data actions are data enabling their IVR, so they're able to identify who the caller is, why they're calling, what skills are associated with this call, what the prioritization of it should be. They're able to make a whole bunch of routing decisions, personalize the call to address the caller by name, and deflect at least half of their calls to self-service. And when the calls actually make it to the agent, they're able to receive screen pops and contextual data that helps them dive right in and start addressing the customer's issues. So that's sort of the power of data actions. That's where we're hoping that we're going to be able to take you. So first, what is a data action? A data action is a pre-composed web service call to an external data store. It has placeholders inside that web service call for dynamic data. What exactly does, we'll get to that in a second, sorry. Who is currently using data actions? Out of all of our PureCloud customers, about 1/3 of them are using data actions. So we've got 1/3 of our existing customer base looks like contact center number 2. They're doing things intelligently. They're trying to be as efficient as possible. But that means we've got about 67% of the existing PureCloud customers are just saying, press 1 for service, press with their agent, and saying, we'll figure it out later. That's not particularly great numbers. So I'm hoping that when we get through with this talk today, you guys are going to be able to go out and help evangelize why data actions are so great and get them implemented so we can pump some of these numbers up. What's interesting is that of customers that are currently using integrations, for example, our Salesforce integration, roughly half of those customers are using data actions. Still not great. I would love it if it was all of them, but it shows that people that are already investing in integrating PureCloud with other systems are a little more apt to be able to use data actions inside of their IVR and really take advantage of all the power the contact center has to offer. So I mentioned placeholder data. This is sort of the driver of what makes a data action function. So I've got a big blob of text on the wall. Sorry about all that, but I'm hoping that I can use this to illustrate a point. What this is actually a URL endpoint for a Salesforce REST API. So it's an API that specifically does searching, and it's using parameters that we're getting earlier on in the call flow in order to make that search. So a data action is being built out with this whole URL saying, this is what I'm going to hit in Salesforce. And when I go to make that call, I'm going to take this input.phone number and I'm going to substitute it in here. So this is going to change slightly when the call is actually executed. But this is what it looks like when it's configured. So how do I use data actions within Architect? There's a couple of key places where data actions are available today, and we're broadening its usage throughout the platform over the coming months. So right now, you can use data actions in Architect call flows, or Architect flows in general. So that's for calls, that's for emails. When chat flows become available here shortly, it'll also be for chats. We're able to, anywhere within that interaction flow, reach out to an external data source, return information, and make decisions based on that. We can also use data actions inside of agent scripts. And there's really two key uses there. The first one I discussed a little bit when we were looking at the differences between our two contact centers. We can use data actions to pre-populate portions of the script with information about our customer. So I can set a part of my agent script to say, go fetch information from Salesforce and give me the caller's first name, give me their state, give me their most recent product that they've purchased, give me their subscription level, tell me when their maintenance ends, let me know if they're eligible for any sort of upgrades. And I can display all of that right in line inside the script. And I'm not storing any of that information inside of PureCloud. That's all staying inside of my CRM. The CRM is still the system of record as far as, what does my customer look like? What have my interactions with them been throughout the past? Coming soon, we'll be adding data actions to dialer pre- and post-call rule sets. And there's some interesting use cases there. One of the things that we'll be able to do with that is validate whether or not we should even make the outbound call based on data that exists inside the CRM. So if we see, hey, someone already signed up for my loyalty program based on another part of my my marketing efforts, well, I don't really want to call them and ask them again to sign up for the loyalty program because they just did it on the website. Or if you're in a collections scenario, I don't want to call someone and say, hey, you've got a payment due when they just made a payment today. We can use data actions to go fetch information from the external data store and say, did they make a payment today? If yes, just abandon this call. We don't need to touch base with them again. For post-call rules, we can utilize things, we can utilize data actions to write things back to the CRM or our ERP. We can use that to take follow-on action. So we can say, if the wrap-up code for this dialer call was terrible call, customer yelled at me, we can automatically set some sort of follow-up, hitting an external system and say, let's send them a text message, let's send them an email, let's send them a survey from Survey Dynamics. We can use data actions to take follow-on actions with external data sources based on the results of our dialer call. We'll also be bringing data actions to other areas of PureCloud. So one of the things that we've been exploring is utilizing data actions as an outreach mechanism for Alto Cloud, to be able to tie Alto Cloud into a whole range of CRMs and kind of pre-fill data for them and do follow-on actions there. So you'll start to see data actions pop up more and more. They're going to become more a critical portion of our integration strategy across the totality of PureCloud services. So why are data actions important to PureCloud? And I want to kind of touch base on why we took this approach and how it lets us be a little more effective in terms of creating integrations. Data actions allow PureCloud services to implement a single interface. So I don't know how many people have gone through looking at the various APIs for CRMs and compared SAP to Oracle Service Cloud to Salesforce to insert your other CRM here. Do they look the same? Are they even in the same ballpark? Generally look at all similar, even the slightest? Well, data actions allow the PureCloud services to talk to all of those different CRMs, all of those different APIs that are out there without having to understand what does it look like to talk to Salesforce and SAP and insert here and insert here. They learn to speak the language of the data action, and the data action handles translations into what's appropriate for Salesforce or what's appropriate for SAP, and on and on and on down the line. So data actions are important to our customers because it allows us to separate out responsibilities. Again, because we've got that separation of the semantics of talking to a particular API and the implementation inside of PureCloud, you don't have to have someone who understands the entire picture building out your call flows or your agent scripts. Like, that is a very, very rare person who understands this is how I'm going to execute Salesforce APIs, and this is how I'm going to design a call flow that creates a reasonable experience for my customer, and take all that information that I'm getting from Salesforce and make educated decisions on that. It's kind of a scary prospect. It's a lot of things to know. People need to be well versed in a bunch of different subjects. Data actions allow us to split that out. And I'll get into how that happens in a little bit, but it's able to do that based on the way data actions are configured. This kind of goes on a little bit more about sort of how we segregate out those responsibilities. So what can you do with data actions? Data actions support JSON-based APIs that support HTTP verbs get, put, patch, and post. We support APIs that do no auth, basic auth, user-defined auth, or something that looks like OAuth, where you're interfacing with an authorization endpoint, you receive some sort of token back, and you're going to substitute that into subsequent calls. So we support all of those. That generally describes the vast majority of REST and Graph APIs that are available today. So there's a lot that you can talk to using data actions. One key thing that I do want to call out is that data actions specifically do not support delete. The reason why is because data actions are basically running headless. It is a PureCloud service calling some external data source. I don't want to be responsible for PureCloud wiping out your CRM data. I don't want to get that phone call. Not going to happen. We just lopped that one off and said no. If you have a really, really, really good use case, maybe, but still probably not. So that's the one kind of giant no-no with data actions. And we've opted not to support some of the more esoteric HTTP verbs, so like head and tail, and then there are a couple other ones out there, but they just didn't seem to have practical usage in most of the APIs that we were looking at. So again, we're willing to listen to use cases, but generally we found that this covers the vast majority of what people are looking to do. Another good usage of data actions is in the area of secure data actions. So this is actually our mechanism for dealing with sensitive data. So this is for credit card processing, this is for looking up of medical health records, this is for dealing with any sort of personally identifiable information that we're trying to send off to an external data store. Secure data actions are a configuration option on the data action. We set a flag that says this one is secure, and it allows it to be the external interface for any of the secure IVR call flows. So if we want to transfer someone in and they're going to make a payment on their account, you're going to utilize secure data actions as the mechanism to talk to the credit card payment processor.
Good question.
Yep.
Do you have to use a secure flow if you're using a secure data action?
Yes. So yeah, that's one of the mechanisms, because otherwise the secure flow has some additional handling within, particularly within the edge for logging, that says I'm not going to even attempt to log any sort of user input capture. So like when you're asking someone for their social security number, if you use that in a regular flow, you're going to log all of the DTMF tones. So you just kind of go upstream in the logs a little bit and like, hey, I didn't log the request and response payloads for the data action because it's secure, but I did log everything that the user inputted to get me to that point. So it's kind of self-defeating. So the secure call flows handle all of that for you and are really sort of clamped down specifically to deal with PCI and HIPAA compliance issues.
Is it a secure transport no matter what? This is just another layer on top of that of security, or?
Yes. So data, and that's a good point. Data actions only support HTTPS invocations. They specifically support TLS 1.1 and 1.2 with a preference for 1.2. And if the service that we're calling doesn't specify, then we'll attempt to negotiate a 1.2 handshake. So secure data actions is more a designation within PureCloud to say this is appropriate for use within a secure IVR call flow and is capable of handling secure variables that are, again, things like social security numbers and credit card numbers. So it's more an internal designation rather than the actual handling of the HTTP semantics. So data actions have two main components. And these two main components are really how we're able to split up those areas of responsibility. So there are the input and output contracts and the request and response configurations. The input and output contracts are the things that you're going to see inside of your call flows. This is the means that someone who doesn't necessarily understand the particulars of interfacing with an API, this is where they're going to engage with data actions. The request and response configurations is more for the person who's intimately familiar with the APIs they're trying to call and understands this is how I'm going to use this and return data back. So the contracts are the forms that are visible inside of Architect, Scripter, and other pieces of PureCloud. They're JSON schemas that generally support simple key value pairs. So it's saying I've got an attribute and it's going to be of this type. So on the input side, we're defining these are the things that I need to make this web service call. And on the output side, it is these are the pieces of data that I'm going to be returning to you. So if you think about this within a call flow, we're going to drop a data action in, and we're going to say I'm going to, for an input, use the customer phone number. So I'm going to collect the phone number on their account. I'm going to plug that in as my input variable. And then on the output side, I'm going to have a whole list of things that I'm going to return back from Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics. That is the customer name, the state that they're calling from, all of the interesting information about that particular customer. We're going to then be able to bind those to variables in our call flow, and we're going to be able to make decisions on them. So we can say, if they're in this state, I'm going to route to this queue because it has to go to this particular state. Or this person speaks Spanish, so I'm going to add Spanish as a required skill for this interaction. Or this is one of my platinum level customers, so I'm going to set the priority to 999 to make sure that it's the first call that's answered out of the queue. So there's a lot of kind of interesting things that we can do. The contracts are where all of those things get surfaced inside of your call flows, or will be what's actually displayed inside of the agent scripts. So like I said, input contracts, generally simple key value pairs. This is going to be that dynamic data that I was referring to before. I won't get into kind of how these things get used later on, because there's a couple of kind of interesting contexts that are appropriate. Output contracts, like I said, are the end result of the action. This is all of the things that we're going to use or display. So now we get into the configurations. So the request configuration is how we're going to talk to the other web service. It is the URL that we're going to talk to. It's the HTTP verb that we're going to use. If it's a put, post, or patch, it's the body that we're going to be sending along as part of the payload to that web service. So this is really defining the particulars of what am I going to fire off as part of this call. Within a configuration, there are three different contexts that are really helpful to understand. So there's the input.foo context. It says we're going to take something from the input contract and we're going to substitute it into our web service call at runtime. So we had the example from earlier where we were taking input.phone number and we're passing that along to the URL that we're eventually searching Salesforce for. So that's one good example there. And the next context we have is credentials dot. So that's actually taking something from our configured credentials and substituting that in. So a really good use case here would be like an API key. So I don't want to hard code my API key into a configuration that's visible inside of PureCloud. I want to keep that in a credential object that's stored securely, and I just want to reference it so it gets substituted in at runtime. So I would use credentials.API key, and that then substitutes that in either as a header or a query string parameter or something else that we're going to be using inside of the data action. And the last one is what we're going to use for some sort of OAuth-like flow. It is the auth response. So for OAuth-like workflows, there is a special data action that's called the auth action. And it does the same thing. It's got its input and output contracts, and then its request and response configurations. But it's specifically responsible for happening in front of all of your other data actions. So it is the thing that's going to authenticate with login.salesforce.com or whatever your authentication endpoint is. Ultimately, the response is generally going to be something that looks like a token. It's going to be on your output contract. You're going to have an output of token. It's going to give you a value. In our subsequent data actions, we're going to configure auth response.token, and then we're going to substitute in the token that we received from the auth action originally. So this is what allows us to engage in OAuth-like workflows with data actions. Okay, so the contexts are what allow us for boilerplating a bunch of our requests. So if you guys remember back to our example from Salesforce, 90% of that URL that we were filling out was already done for us. We were saying, we want you to return all of these different values. We're searching this particular API endpoint. The only thing that wasn't boilerplate in our data action was the input context that we were using. So that input.phone number was the dynamic part. Everything else was just kind of hard-coded in there. For most of our web service calls, that's generally going to be sufficient, and we're able to use the context to fill in those variables, the things that are going to be different between each of the different action calls. Okay, so now we get a little further into the request configuration. So the next thing that we're able to define is our URL template, which is where are we going to go to interact with this other service. It can either include the base URL or be the entire URL that we're trying to interface with. Then we've got our request type, which is the verb that we're using, the headers that we're going to be sending along with this, so we can define what sort of responses are going to be acceptable, whether they should cache things, if we're using a token and it's supposed to go on a bearer header, this would be where we'd fill that in. So anything that you would normally use, if you're using Postman to fill out an API call, you would take all of the things that are in headers in Postman and you would fill these in for your data action. And then lastly, we've got the request template. So this is the actual body that gets sent along with it. So if we're doing a put, a post, or a patch because we're trying to create a new object or we're trying to update an object in our external source, this is where all of that information is going to go. Okay, so now we get into the response. So we've put together our whole request, we've fired it off to Salesforce, they've sent us back a giant blob of JSON. Now we need to figure out how do we deal with this and get it back to our simple form that we can use in Architect. And that's where the translation map comes into play. So the translation map uses a technology called JSON path, which defines how you're going to walk a JSON document. So you're able to say, I'm going to this particular node and I'm going to pull out this attribute. And with the translation map, you're able to define, I want that to be this simple key value pair. We'll get into an example a little bit later. But this is generally how you're going to take really complex response objects and you're going to break them apart into things that are simpler to understand as they get downstream. The translation map defaults are a mechanism for setting default values if the translation map doesn't return anything. So using our example from Salesforce, the response is actually going to be an object called search results. And inside of search results, there are going to be records. We can say we want the first record inside of search results as our response for our translation map. But what happens if Salesforce doesn't find anything? Well, then we wind up with an empty object and things just sort of blow up and it's kind of terrible. This is where a translation map default comes into play. So we can say we want to just substitute in a default value if we go through that whole JSON path process and there's nothing there. The default values only get returned if the response in our initial translation map isn't going to return anything. And then lastly is our success template. So this is a mechanism for building out the entirety of that output form. So this is ultimately what our output contract is. There should be a one-to-one relationship between the success template and what we're sending to the output contract. But this is where we're able to take different pieces of our translation map and substitute them into something that's a little more complete. So all of this sounds kind of complicated. Luckily, we have some tools to try and make things a little bit easier for you. So personally, I don't like dealing with JSON schema. I always wind up leaving off contracts or not putting in close braces. I miss parentheses all the time. It's not fun. You get the little red X that shows up in your editor, and it's just kind of a pain. You're like, what did I miss now? Well, one of the things that we've added to our UI is a schema builder that allows us to say, I've got a thing, I'm going to call it phone number, and it's a string, and I'm able to designate it as required. And this actually builds the underlying JSON schema that's going to be returned later on. And I can do it just as a simple WYSIWYG editor here. Then we've got our configuration builder. So this allows us to, instead of having to build a really complicated JSON document that says, this is where my request URL is, and this is the verb that I'm using, and these are the headers, and this is the body that I'm going to be sending along, we're able to break those apart into individual pieces and make it a little bit easier to interact with. We also have a test mode built into the UI. So before we publish these data actions, we can actually test them. We can say, what would happen if I were to send Salesforce this phone number? What results are going to come back? What happens if it finds more than one result? What happens if it doesn't find any? Did I get my translation map default set up correctly? The output of this is actually going to be a form that mimics what you would see in Architect or Scripter. So you can make sure, okay, I've got all of my bindings done correctly, and I can see it all right here in the UI before I publish it and do something that can't be undone. Apparently, I left off a slide on this one. One of the other important things to note is data actions allow for importing and exporting. So on the summary page for each of the data actions, you're going to have an import and export button. And it's going to create JSON files that you'll be able to take out of one org and drop it into another one. So you can build things out in a developer org, you can test it in developer call flows, you could have a partner working on things, you can engage with our professional services organization, and they'll be able to build all of these things out for you. You can then take that and drop it directly into your own call flow, or drop it into your own organization by doing an import. You can test it, then publish it, and then start binding everything into Architect call flows or your scripts or whatever. The Architect call flows themselves can also be imported. So we're trying to leverage that same philosophy that you're seeing elsewhere throughout PureCloud, and we're going to be able to import and export things to make your lives easier. So I can set it up in a test environment, I can share it across multiple orgs, I can ask partners to do stuff for me. So yeah. So that kind of brings me to the end of my talk here. So I'll open it up and see if there's any questions, comments, concerns. Sir?
Yeah, so is there any reporting on the data actions? For example, like daily reporting, like to summarize how the data actions are used, what's the input and output and request response, something like that?
So the first part of your question is actually something that's currently under development. So we're looking at providing usage metrics around data action. So it's going to be things like how many times was each one invoked? What was the HTTP responses for each of those invocations? How long did those invocations run? What was the average length? How many retries were in there? The specifics around what the request and response payloads were, that's not something that we're entertaining at this point in time, because generally we're trying to have data actions be secure by default. So if we're logging, hey, we're sending all of this information off to Salesforce and these are the responses we're getting, there's the potential that you wind up with sensitive data that works its way in there because someone misunderstands and says, oh, here, I'm going to give you my PIN as my zip code. We have no way of knowing that's what they did, but now there it is in the logs, and it could be problematic. So generally we're going to avoid that. But the usage metrics is something that we're working on and will hopefully be seen by the end of the year. If not, it'll be the early part of 2020.
Okay, makes sense. Another question that actually we had this incident like 4 weeks ago where this data actions stopped working. We didn't find out until like hours later because all of the incoming callers became unknown callers. We had this data action lookup, given the phone number, find the corresponding people. And that functionality stopped working for hours. I was wondering if there was any like monitoring or alerting around data actions.
So that's actually part of what the usage metrics are intended to start providing. So the step one is to provide some sort of dashboard so you at least have some visibility into it. Then step two is to be able to say, if I reach this kind of threshold on this particular data action, or I see you know, if I see all of a sudden I'm getting a whole bunch of, you know, 404, like 404 unfounds or 403 forbiddens as responses, go ahead and send me a text message on that. So that's kind of phase 2. Thing 1 is just we need to get all the numbers there for you. And then once we have those, we can start taking intelligent actions on that. So we're working on it. Also, I think I remember specifically your care case and what happened there. That shouldn't happen anymore. Something very, very strange happened there. I don't want to get into too many details.
Yeah, we'll open on that one, okay.
Okay.
I have a comment on that one.
Uh-huh.
So I'm trying to find the name, but there was a very recent feature release that allows us to track like self-service outcomes in Architect. So what you can do is put one of these, I don't remember their exact name, I think of them as like trackers or pins. The flow outcomes.
So on a failure.
So you can put a flow outcome on your data div, so if you get results, flow outcome success. If you get no results or an error, flow outcome failure. And there's just a dashboard so you can watch your failures climb and say what's up.
But you're limited to 50 flow outcomes per flow.
Yes. If you need more than that, your flow is kind of crazy. That's fun.
Per all.
Oh, is it for org?
Per all.
No. I haven't gotten any of that high up there yet. You can create those pretty easily. And you can use them to track other things. I use them to track IVR options. We're choosing option 4 to go to a punt group on some other PBX. I have a flow outcome for that, so I know how many times I hit this other PBX.
So that's also another use case that people have used data actions for, is to specifically log like what path are we traversing within Architect. So they'll just put another action in there that says, I selected this, and this is what my customer input, and they're going to write that off to their own thing.
We do that too. We don't even write something. We just do the data action call, and just the count of hits is all we need. We don't need results.
Okay, good deal.
We're just saying we got 50 hits. That was 50 calls.
Good deal. Very good deal. So
that'll help your data in the future until the rest of it's there.
I've noticed an oddity when building data actions. That creating data action, and sometimes you've got to go through a couple of settings because you've got something from another company, ServiceNow or whatever, someone sent you a URL, and you save it and test, but the test doesn't reflect what you just saved. So you go back into admin, go back into the data action, and then it reflects what you saved.
I've had that a bunch too.
So you have, before you save, you get the little dots to tell you that you've got updated changes. You save that, you then go straight into test.
Okay.
It won't use the new config.
Sometimes.
So yeah, it does seem to be a bit intermittent. But if, if you save, go back into admin, back into data actions, it's fine. It's a bit like if you look at the old bridge things for refresh, they don't. You have to go back in. So
strange.
It seems to be it's a UI related oddity. It seems.
Yeah, so I'll have to take that up with our admin UI team, because that is something. Initially, it wasn't ever updating ever, so that was really kind of painful. You'd either have to leave and come back every time if you wanted to test, or refresh the page.
I've not gone to the stage of looking at network logging to see what's going on.
Okay.
It's just I thought I'd mention it as
Okay. Yeah. That'll be something I'll have to take a look at, and if there's a specific example where you do have those network logs or console logs for it, that would be really helpful to try and run that down. My guess is it's probably around fetching the updated draft from the API. It seems strange that the admin UI is not handling that appropriately, but we can take a look at it. So
yeah. I've noticed it most when I'm building data actions to talk back to PureCloud more than to other platforms.
Strange.
Customers with data, because of external contacts, we've used data actions quite often to look at telephone numbers, etc. in there, and then there'll be some minor modifications. You occasionally get an error if you've got a null value in some fields, so you don't have to.
Yeah, so that's strange because, like, from the data action perspective, it's like that's no different than anything else. Like they're all using the PureCloud public API, and the only thing that we're doing is handling auth gracefully for you. But otherwise, it looks just like the web service data actions.
It's just that the first time that I found it, I spent half an hour trying to check my code and go, I can't see what's wrong. I logged out, went back in, and it worked.
Okay, yeah, that would be frustrating. That would be very frustrating. So, yeah, no, that's one. I would need to see some examples, and we can try and chase that down with the admin of iTunes. Okay, good deal. Very good deal. Yes, sir.
Pre and post call rules, are those going to be available for more than just the call interaction type?
I believe so. The one thing that you may potentially run into is there are some concurrency limits to the number of data actions that you can have in flight at one time. That's done specifically. We've had some customers that, for some reason, their API endpoints just start taking forever to return, and that leaves open thread pools on the service, and that's just kind of terrible for us. Eventually, we run out of threads, and the service falls over and dies, and no one's data actions work. So we had to say, no, you can't have all the threads at once. So that may be one area where you start getting into, you might run into some performance issues there, particularly working with digital channels. And if you're trying to hit a particularly non-performant API, I believe the concurrency limit is 15 in flight at one time. Generally, that's pretty good, but we have had one or two customers that have run into that, so that's just something to be aware of. But my understanding is the pre and post call data actions are just a dialer thing, so any campaign that they support, regardless of media channel, should be able to do that. So I think I saw a question over this way. Yes? No?
Okay, so if Lumber also is asking, so there's another challenge like we continue having with in general PureCloud kind of environment where there's like we found a change management. For example, we want to make a change, because right now we have one kind of PureCloud instance, but in general we have the dev, staging, and production kind of logical environments within the same box. Right now, it's a challenge for us to promote the changes from dev to staging and production, singing this. So basically, we have to copy or import or export from here and there. So, but this is not limited just to data action, but also to architect IVR flows and all that.
Yep.
I'm wondering if there's enough requests for Genesis to develop a nature way to promote changes, to manage the change management.
That is something that we're looking at, and it's really more related to community involvement around those sorts of objects. So, one of the things that we've gotten a lot of requests for is examples for like a credit card payment flow. So, just what does it look like to collect a card number, to validate an expiration date and a CVV number, and then do a data dip to return a billing address, and then assemble all of that into a create token with my credit card processor, and then use all of that to turn that into actually executing a transaction. So those sorts of kind of narrow use cases that can be pretty well fleshed out in examples. The intent is to start bringing some of those examples either somewhere in the App Foundry or some other distribution mechanism, but have a little bit more intelligent importing there. So, figuring out this integration doesn't exist yet, like the action ID doesn't exist. Do you have one that you want to drop in here and retain all the bindings? That integration doesn't exist. Do you want to create one? And kind of walk through those things. So sort of work your way upstream and handle all of the dependencies for importing and exporting things. So that'll be work that'll be coming along here again later this year, early part of next year. But we have seen that as an area for improvement and want to go there. So
Good to know.
Okay.
Yes. Also, the IVR flows architect has the notion of version control. So, you can go back to certain versions, you can see the current versions made by someone.
Yep.
For data actions, are you going to do the same thing, to version control that?
So he was saying in Architect there is a mechanism to be able to see the version number and to revert back to previous versions and to see who made changes. We are logging a fair amount of that to our audit service currently. It's not exposed in a place that you can get at it, but we've been kind of preemptively throwing things there. The one thing that I don't believe that it does is the differentiation. It just says this person made this change at this date, and so you really, what we wanted to keep it as lightweight as possible. So you have one draft and then the actual published copy. So I don't know that we're ever going to get into the realm of like long-term version control, because generally with data actions, what we've been seeing is that it's a set it up, tinker with it until it works, and then publish it, put it in the flows, and forget about it until it breaks. Which is hopefully never, but you know.
In the roadmap discussion earlier, audit logging is on the list.
Yes.
No scope on what it'll cover, but I would hope it covers data actions.
Yeah.
So we've had open a few support tickets for like our data actions suddenly broke, and then we learned there was a bug that got fixed where unpublished data actions were being treated as published. And we had a couple where another engineer set it up and it worked, so he said, cool. And then you guys fixed the bug, and all these unpublished ones broke as they should have.
So
But we didn't catch that, so I was
yeah.
hoping
So it
tickets
was
with
more.
support
There was more around enabled integrations.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of something that got missed when we were building it out, because like it doesn't make sense that an integration that isn't enabled should actually work.
Yeah.
But it did, just kind of by accident.
Yeah. So we started with
So
audit logging.
yeah, so we fixed the glitch and it caused some other problems.
Yeah.
But
I think it was support trying to figure out who broke it. I was like, who
Uh-huh.
updated my data action? This isn't working, and then support comes back, oh no, we fixed the bug. So audit logging would have fixed that.
Luckily, the customer wasn't live, but I noticed that the integration wasn't published, but all my calls were working.
Yeah.
So I published, I enabled it anyway.
Yep,
But,
and that was one, like we're trying to take that as a little bit of a learning experience. So we did try to reach out, particularly through the CARE organization, to say, hey, we're doing this thing, it's kind of a breaking change. You should know about this, customers should be advised, and it just didn't make it all the way out, which was, it was kind of unfortunate, but you know, it was one of those things, like I said, it didn't make a ton of sense that it worked it that way in the first place. So we were trying to make it make more sense long
If you had
term.
like an accident and then you tested it, it worked.
Uh-huh.
Run forward, it worked.
Yeah, exactly. It worked now, it should work forever, right?
Yeah.
So,
Ish.
yeah. So no, we're trying to take some of those things as learning experiences here too. So.
Yeah. Actually, speaking of that, so like on one side, it's good that to have this cloud offering where we don't need to worry about upgrade because it keeps coming might flip. But on the other hand, we got no control over these updates, and we never know. Maybe at certain time points, we might break some of our stuff. That instance happens all the time. So I was wondering, like, if we could do some automated test cases, like running regularly to check those updates against our own kind of configuration. But we couldn't find such good tooling around test automation to verify, like, end-to-end, does the data action work after this rollout of the update or not? So something like that. In general, basically.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of a tricky subject, because there are going to be points in time where there are breaking changes that are pushed out on the platform, and I think, identifying what the preferred communication channel for you guys is to be made aware that, hey, this breaking change is coming. I think that's really going to be where our investment is best spent. Whether that is having something that's sort of analogous to release notes that are like breaking change notifications that you can subscribe to, or put yourself on a mailing list, or if that's something that you'd rather hear coming through your CSM, or if you happen to have one, a technical account manager or something like that. I would be interested in understanding what your preferred mechanism of communication on those things is going to be, and then we'll just be more diligent about trying to wire those things up. Because in terms of breaking changes, like on the Developer Center, we publish notifications at least 60 days and generally significantly more than that in advance that, hey, we're deprecating something or works. And we try not to push breaking changes without those notifications because there's a significant amount of automated testing that goes on in PureCloud around all of these resources to say, no, it's still doing things the way that it did before. So we know in advance if we're going to be pushing a breaking change. The big thing is making sure that you guys are up to speed too. So
yeah, so I guess 99% of the cases like this, it would be nice to know that in advance that it's a breaking changes, but there's still a slight chance where neither of us knows. So when you push out some changes, you thought, okay, it shouldn't be backward compatible, but actually, for some whatever reason, like maybe we misuse the product so that update actually broadcasts. So for that kind of changes, I think like communication on one hand probably won't solve that. That's why we were looking some kind of like other prevention method to implement so that we'll hopefully react that quicker than nature. So something like that.
yeah, and I'm not sure what a great answer would be for you there. In our own usage, we have our own test environments that we're using, and we're explicitly hitting all of those APIs using our own test cases, and that just runs as part of either a scheduled process or anytime there's a new build or something like that. It may be that you guys are looking at like recreating something that looks kind of like that with your own environment that's not production data. I don't know that I have a ton of great guidance for you. It's a tricky problem all over. So
it's a challenge for you too. So okay, thanks.
okay, good deal. Any other questions? All right, well, super. Then I will give you guys back a couple minutes of your day. So thank you much.
Thank you.